Ho ho! What do you know? Here we are, together again. You, me. It's been a long time, but it's just about time here for quotes of the week. Let me tell you, you all look great. I hope you're doing well. So, things we're not going to be talking about this week. We're not going to be talking about the female graduates who became Army Rangers, although I think that's great news. The Navy also announced they're going to be allowing women candidates to graduate from their Navy SEAL program, which is great, something that I support. We won't be talking about wildfires across the West. I'm generally anti-wildfire. And we won't be talking about what happened today. North Korea and South Korea allegedly exchanging fire across their borders for the first time in 5 years, and I'm pretty much anti that kind of aggression as well. But here we go, things we are going to be talking about. Even though the school year is just beginning and we're only about halfway through 2015, it's never too early to start thinking ahead. And according to the United Nations, the world's going to be adding another billion people in the next 15 years, bringing the total global population from 7.3 billion, where we sit right now in the middle of 2015, to 8.5 billion in 2030. That'll jump to 9.7 billion in 2050 and 11.2 billion in 2100. So where is all this growth coming from? Well, it's certainly not coming from Europe, because that continent is getting older all the time. It's coming from Africa, expected to double in population by the year 2100, because the continent is incredibly young. Half the continent's population is under the age of 24. Within the next decade or so, all those people will then be having kids of their own, and then you're going to see the population of Africa just take off, as you can see from that particular chart there. Now, there are some people, though, trying to get into Europe as we speak. There's been a refugee crisis going on across that continent for a long time, and it seems now that arrivals on the Greek island of Lesbos are now really causing all sorts of infrastructure problems and political problems in Greece, which already had political and economic problems and has been dealing with them for a very, very long time. And last week alone, 20,843 migrants, most of them fleeing the ongoing civil war in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, have arrived in Greece. 160,000 migrants have landed on its shores since January. Okay, we're back. Yes, there's a bit of a jump cut there. I know the camera angle is a little bit different now. It's much later in the day. I'm even more disheveled than I was the first time I started recording. This whole thing's kind of a work in progress. We're going to see whether or not it works. You can let me know what you think. So we were talking about what's been going on with all the people trying to flee ISIS and all the turmoil in the Middle East, and certainly that wave of immigration has been met with some opposition in these European countries, people that don't want all these people being given asylum that are now making their way into their countries. And the demographics are changing. The demographics of our country are changing as well. I found this really interesting map, and if you look at all the different years on here, you can click to this website and it kind of explains what's going on. When you go to the website, it's from a Time magazine service looking at census data and projections by the U.S. Census Group. Shows whether or not your state is from the past or from the future. And the state that I now call home, Texas, actually is looking into the future, the year 2060, when the racial and ethnic makeup of my new home state will resemble pretty much what the entire country is going to look like. Here in Texas, a third of the population is Hispanic, less than half the population is white. Now, where you guys are back in Kansas, you are living in 1989. What a year it was. My sophomore year in high school, as a matter of fact. 77% white in Kansas, 6% black, 11% Hispanic, 2% Asian. So you're living in the past, but you're not Iowa. Not Iowa, way back in 1930, and you can see those demographics down here. So this is where the country is headed. Things are changing all the time. Of course, there are some politicians that are interested in changing that. We will not be taken advantage of anymore. This quote coming from the man on the cover of Time magazine this week. We see him there course, Mr. Trump, Republican presidential hopeful Donald Trump, earlier this week making his most specific, spelled out policy statement on immigration. A 6-page report he released called Immigration Reform That Will Make America Great Again, called for an end to birthright citizenship, and repeated his commitment to build a wall on the United States southern border. Now, he said a lot of inflammatory things about Mexico and about immigrants from different parts of the world to our country earlier this summer. Seems like he can't possibly be elected, right? Can't even possibly get the Republican nomination. Well, a new CNN survey released Wednesday of this week found that Trump, who's actually leading both the national and early state polls in his Republican Party primary race, trailing the Democratic frontrunner Hillary Clinton by only 6 percentage points, which is stunning considering that Clinton was ahead of Trump in a hypothetical general election by 16 points just in July. So he seems to be narrowing the gap, even though he is a very controversial figure and will continue to be so, and is on the record as saying that if he cannot get the Republican nomination, he would consider running as a third-party candidate, which could end up hurting the Republican Party in the long run. So we'll be following these election updates, of course, as we keep having these Quotes of the Week segments. 2 weeks ago, the world marked the 70th anniversary of the first atomic bomb attack in history. It was August 6, 1945, when the bomb, codenamed Little Boy, killed 66,000 people when it hit Hiroshima, Japan, mostly civilians, and injured at least 69,000. At least that was according to the estimates the U.S. Army officially gave back in 1946. Most Americans at the time, even today, can't realize how terrible the effects of the bomb were. The only time that and 3 days later, August 9th, 1945, atomic bombs were ever used actually in war. Leading politicians went out of their way to mislead the public about the effects of radiation. The person in charge of the Manhattan Project even told the Senate in November of 45 that radiation sickness was, quote, a very pleasant way to die, which is just a stunning thing to fathom. And even though we can't picture this, we can't imagine what it would have been like to be there when that bomb hit, a nuclear historian has created a series of maps that lets all of us now see what this would have looked like. So here's an example of the nuke map if it would have hit part of our country here. You see this area around Washington, some of the museums. Basically, the fireball radius is what you see right here. So everything, of course, there destroyed. We've got an air blast radius to here, a radiation radius, 50 to 90% mortality rate within the green radius here, and then thermal radiation extending out this far. Now, when you actually go to the nuke map, you can type in different cities. They have some examples, but it gives us the ability to see what it would look like if the exact same bomb with the force of Little Boy that landed on Hiroshima, Japan, would have landed in Overland Park, Kansas, for example. So once this comes into view, we'll be able to type in any city you want, and then you can select from a preset, a set of presets, or type in your own yield. I'm going to go ahead and type in Overland Park, Kansas. Now it's going to take you to the center of Overland Park, Kansas. We're not going to imagine that the bomb dropped directly right there on Blue Valley North. But if we were to go ahead and choose Little Boy, and we're going to go ahead and do surface, burst, and have all of these effects show up, casualties, radioactive fallout, and then detonate it. And then it shows, we see these numbers totaling up here, 4,220 fatalities, more than 10,000 estimated injuries, and the radiation fallout, if you zoom out, extending out to the northeast. Now that's a 15 kiloton bomb. If you were to look at some of the ones that are currently in the U.S. arsenal, We can see these. Let's take, for example, this one, 350 kilotons, and detonate that. And look at those fatalities rack up: 69,610, more than 221,000 estimated injuries, and how far out the radioactive fallout would reach. And that's the power that we currently have in our arsenal right now. So nuclear proliferation, certainly a hot topic. President trying to broker that deal to try to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions. We'll have to wait to see if the Senate's actually going to go ahead and ratify that deal. Speaking of World War II, as we just were with the 70th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bombs, two people in Poland say they may have found a Nazi train rumored to be full of gold, gems, and guns disappeared back in the Second World War. A train believed to have gone missing near what is now the Polish city of Wrocław as Soviet forces approached back towards the end of the war, as they were coming out after the Battle of Stalingrad, driving the Nazis back towards Germany. A law firm in Poland says it's contacted the two guys who discovered this armored train, which had been missing, perhaps gone into a hidden tunnel. Polish media said that the men want 10% of the value of anything that's found on that particular train. And speaking of treasures from long ago, treasure hunters in Florida found 350 gold coins from a fleet of Spanish ships that sank way back in the 18th century. The man who owns the rights to the shipwreck said the coins were discovered in shallow water. These coins were only 3 feet deep, just 10 feet away from the shore. Nobody found them up until now. 9 of the coins, known as royals, were made especially for King Philip V of Spain, valued at $300,000 apiece, just those royals. According to state law, Florida has a law on the books there that if any of these old shipwrecks are found that have treasure, they get to keep 20% of the treasure. And the treasure, this particular shipwreck, is valued at $4.5 million. So we'll continue our look at history, and we're going to now take a break and look at Tales from Putin Land, one of our favorite segments here in Quotes of the Week. There's been a crackdown on illegal activity in Russia. They've busted an alleged smuggling gang that made around $30 million by illegally importing cheese. According to a statement from Moscow police, 470 tons of cheese were seized during this week's raid. If convicted, the 6 suspects face up to a decade behind bars. What's going on? This is one of the many Western products that is now forbidden in Russia, as there is a kind of an ongoing battle of sanctions between the West and Russia. The West imposed sanctions on Russia after its annexation of the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine more than a year ago, and the ongoing alleged meddling that Russia is engaging in the war in the eastern part of Ukraine. You're looking at a dangerous creature right there. Squirrels. Be very careful. California Department of Public Health investigating a possible second case of plague. Yes, plague. Contracted by a tourist who recently visited Yosemite National Park less than 2 weeks after announcing that a child who camped at the campground had the disease. 2 squirrels had died from the plague, leading officials to shut down a campsite. 42 people have caught the plague in California since 1970. If you look at that map, those are all the reported cases of plague going back from 1970 through 2012. Tend to be in kind of outlying areas, campsites, places like that, spread by rodents. In addition to the California cases, 2 people contracted the plague this year in Colorado. Both of them, a teenager, 16-year-old young man who's about to start his sophomore year in Colorado, actually died of the plague. Plague's nothing to toy with. Speaking of children's things, characters of Sesame Street. Why would I be having the characters of Sesame Street? What could they possibly have in common with, say, Game of Thrones? how could it be that perhaps is the rumor true that Ernie and Bert are going to be the new lead stars of the next season of True Detective? Well, beginning later this fall and lasting for the next 5 seasons, all the first episodes of Sesame Street will first air on HBO. They're still going to air on PBS, but they're not going to air on PBS till several months after they've already aired on HBO. They used to only be able to make 18 episodes a year of Sesame Street. That's going to go up to 35 on HBO. And you could say, well, kids are going to get to watch the shows for free on PBS eventually. But it's kind of sad in a way. Sesame Street was started decades ago for low-income families that could not afford to put their kids into some sort of preschool program before they officially started kindergarten. It was designed to fill that gap. And now the first run episodes will be airing on pay television on HBO. So it's a bit disappointing. So that relationship between Sesame Street and HBO is a new one, but the relationship between Star Wars and Disney continues to grow. The Walt Disney Company announced just this week that Star Wars themed lands are coming to Disneyland Park in California and Hollywood Studios at Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida. Each of these lands will stretch across 14 acres. And Disney chairman Bob Iger's quote there, "We're creating a jaw-dropping new world that represents our largest single theme land expansion ever. These new lands at Disneyland and Walt Disney World will transport guests to a whole new Star Wars planet. We'll be able to have battles, allegedly be able to fly the Millennium Falcon." So for all of you Star Wars fans out there, something to look forward to, along with, of course, the new movie that comes out as we get closer to the holiday season. So something that's very much out of this world. Right, so we're going to end this week with something that's also out of this world, and no, it's not Donald Trump, although that would be a good guess. It's another politician, not even from our country, but our neighbors to the north in Canada will be having their own election coming up in October. And they've got their own wackadoodle candidate. He's an independent candidate. His name is Wyatt Scott. He's running for a seat in Parliament. He has a fascinating campaign commercial that I so wanted to be able to show you in this particular format, but it will not let me play it back. It keeps buffering and it just won't work. So here's what you need to do. You got to promise me that you're going to search for Wyatt Scott. I'm running for Parliament, and I promise you, you will not be disappointed. You will be just like me, watching it over and over and over again. So that's all I have for this week. It's great to see all of you again. We'll be back next week for another edition of Quotes of the Week. Have a fantastic weekend. Enjoy all of the first La Liga games of this particular season.